You know that specific smell of cheap latex and desperation? That's what hit me the moment the elevator doors slid open on the 44th floor. It was a Tuesday, a day usually reserved for code reviews and drinking enough black coffee to kill a draft horse. But today, the open plan office looked like a gender reveal party for a demon. Purple and gold balloons were bobbing against the air vents, tied to ergonomic chairs with curling ribbon that probably cost more than the intern's hourly wage. I stood there clutching my travel mug, a beat-up stainless steel thing that had survived 3 mergers, a hostile takeover, and the dot-com crash of 2001. That mug had seen more corporate warfare than most CEOs. My name's Andrew Morrison. I'm 48 years old, and I've been building computer systems since before most of these kids knew what a floppy disk was. Started programming COBOL back when Y2K was an actual crisis, not just a Wikipedia entry. Survived the dot-com bubble, the 2008 recession, and enough digital transformations to fill a graveyard. My team, a group of brilliant, sleep-deprived engineers who could code a sentient AI out of a toaster and some copper wire, looked like hostages in a bank robbery where the robbers were forcing them to do the Macarena. Dennis, my lead engineer, caught my eye and gave me a look that said, "Help us." Ellen from database operations was literally hiding behind her monitor. Francis from security looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. These were good people. I'd mentored most of them through their first big projects, taught them the difference between code that works and code that lasts. Dennis still called me for advice on weekends. Ellen brought me homemade cookies every Christmas. Francis and I had rebuilt the entire authentication system together during a 72-hour marathon session last year, living on energy drinks and determination. Standing on a makeshift stage made of pallets and fake turf was Carol Whitfield. Carol, the CEO's daughter-in-law. She was 26, had an MBA from a university that advertises during daytime court TV shows, and wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes because the Botox had set up a perimeter defense. Her background was social media marketing. Specifically, she'd managed the Instagram account for a boutique candle company for 8 months before marrying into tech royalty. "Andrew!" Carol squealed, her voice hitting a frequency that I'm pretty sure is illegal in the European Union. She waved a perfectly manicured hand at me. "You're just in time for the pivot." I walked over, my boots clicking on the polished concrete floor. It was a rhythmic sound, click, clack, the sound of a clock counting down. Oh, they didn't know it yet. Behind me, I could hear my team whispering. They knew something was wrong. In 2.5 years working together, we'd never had surprise meetings with balloon decorations. The pivot, Carol? We're 3 weeks away from the Phase 1 launch. The infrastructure is 90% integrated. You can't pivot a battleship in a bathtub. She laughed. It was a tinkling, condescending sound like ice cubes hitting the bottom of an empty glass. "Oh, Andrew, you're so analog. We're not building a battleship anymore. We're building a movement." She gestured to the screen behind her with the enthusiasm of a game show hostess. My architectural diagrams, 2.5 years of my life, thousands of hours of structural logic, the proprietary backbone that was currently holding up the company's entire $120 million valuation, were gone. Vanished. In their place was a slide that just said Synergy 2.0 in a font that looked like it was written in crayon by a kindergartner having a seizure. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not panic. I'd learned years ago that panic was a luxury engineers couldn't afford. This was recognition, the same feeling I'd had in 2008 when I watched Lehman Brothers collapse, or in 2001 when the first dot-com darling started folding, the feeling of watching gravity reassert itself. "I've been appointed transformation director," Carol announced, beaming at the room like she'd just cured cancer. The applause was scattered, terrified. A few people clapped because they didn't know what else to do. Most just stared. "And my first act is to democratize the leadership. Andrew, you've done steady work. Really solid. But we need fresh eyes. We need digital natives." Digital natives. I'd heard that phrase before, usually right before someone tried to replace 20 years of hard-won experience with enthusiasm and a YouTube tutorial. I'd been called analog before too, usually by people who couldn't debug their way out of a paper bag, but knew all the latest buzzwords. She pointed to a kid standing next to the ficus plant. "Jeffrey here will be taking over as lead architect for the final rollout." Jeffrey was 22. Jeffrey wore loafers without socks and once asked me if Sequel was the sequel to a movie he hadn't seen. Jeffrey had been with the company for 6 weeks, spent most of his time updating his LinkedIn profile, and thought legacy code was just old stuff that didn't matter anymore. The silence that followed was heavy. It had mass. It had gravitational pull. I could feel it pressing down on the room like the atmospheric pressure before a tornado. My lead engineer, Dennis, looked at me with wide eyes, silently begging me to scream, to throw a chair, to do something. Ellen had gone pale. Francis was slowly shaking his head. They knew what this meant. They knew what Jeffrey didn't. That our system wasn't just code, it was an ecosystem. A living, breathing network of dependencies and safeguards that had taken years to perfect. But I didn't scream. I'm a systems architect. I don't deal in chaos. I deal in logic gates and load balancers and the kind of methodical thinking that keeps servers from catching fire. And the logic here was flawed, catastrophically so, but the contract was absolute. Jeffrey, I said, my voice dead. Calm. Do you know what the load balancer latency threshold is for the primary cluster? Jeffrey blinked. His confident smile wavered like a Wi-Fi signal in a thunderstorm. We're going to move everything to the cloud, right? So, 0? Right, I said. 0. The irony wasn't lost on me. 0 was exactly what they'd have left when this was over. I looked at Carol. She was glowing with the triumph of the incompetent, that special radiance that comes from being absolutely certain you're brilliant while standing on the edge of a cliff. She thought she was clearing out the old guard, making room for innovation. She thought she was winning. She had no idea she was pulling the pin on a grenade and tucking it into her designer handbag. See, the thing about being 48 in tech is that you've seen this movie before. You've watched hotshot MBAs walk into engineering departments like conquistadors, convinced that 25 years of accumulated knowledge could be replaced with fresh thinking and positive energy. I'd watched it happen at 3 previous companies. Each time, the carnage was spectacular. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just some senior engineer who could be shuffled aside. This time, I held the keys to the kingdom, and I'd learned from those earlier disasters. I'd prepared. So, Carol said, clasping her hands together like she was about to lead a team-building exercise, I know this is a transition, Andrew. We'll keep you on for 2 weeks to transfer knowledge. You can work from the overflow cubicle near the bathrooms. It'll be quieter for you to write up the documentation for Jeffrey. The disrespect was breathtaking. It was almost art. After 2.5 years of 70-hour weeks, after building the foundation that kept their lights on, after mentoring half the engineering staff and personally debugging every major system failure, she wanted to stick me in a closet next to the men's room like a piece of outdated equipment. I could see the shock on my team's faces. Dennis looked like someone had just told him his dog died. Ellen was staring at her keyboard, probably wondering if she should update her resume. Francis was clenching and unclenching his fists. These people had become more than colleagues over the years. We'd been through the trenches together, pulled all-nighters fixing critical bugs, celebrated successful launches with beer and pizza at 2 a.m. I set my travel mug down on the nearest desk. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for a weapon, though in a just world I might have considered it, but for something far more powerful. My badge. A heavy magnetic key card that gave me access to the server rooms, the executive suites, and the hidden freight elevator that Carol probably didn't even know existed. No need, I said, my voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd been planning for this moment since the day Carol first showed up and started using words like ideate and synergize in status meetings. Carol tilted her head like a golden retriever confused by a magic trick. Excuse me? I don't need 2 weeks, I said. I slid the badge across the table. It spun and stopped right at the edge, teetering. One small vibration and it would fall. How poetic. I resign. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. I could see Carol's brain struggling to process what had just happened. In her world, people didn't quit. They were managed out, repositioned, optimized. But they didn't just walk away from steady paychecks and health insurance. You can't just quit, Carol scoffed, but there was a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. We have a board meeting at 5 p.m. The investors are coming to see the demo. My father-in-law specifically said you needed to be there to answer the technical questions. Jeffrey is the lead architect now, I said, smoothing down my jacket with deliberate care. He's a digital native. I'm sure he can explain the synergy. Behind Carol, Jeffrey was starting to look like a deer caught in headlights. He was probably realizing that being put in charge of a $120 million project was like being handed the controls of a nuclear reactor when your previous experience was changing batteries in a smoke detector. "Andrew, stop being dramatic," Carol snapped, her carefully maintained composure starting to crack like old paint. "You're staying. That's an order." I looked at her. I looked at the balloons. I looked at the fear in my team's eyes. I thought about my mortgage, paid off 3 years ago. I thought about my retirement account, carefully built up through 25 years of saving and smart investing. I thought about the weekend I'd spent last month in my garage, rebuilding a 1969 Camaro engine just because I enjoyed working with my hands and understanding how things fit together. Most of all, I thought about the contract I'd written 2.5 years ago, when they desperately needed someone to fix their dying infrastructure. The contract nobody had bothered to read carefully because they'd been too panicked about their servers catching fire. "I'm not an employee anymore, Carol. I'm a civilian, and civilians don't take orders from transformation directors." I turned around. I could feel their eyes on my back. Not just Carol's, but my entire team's. They knew something was happening, something bigger than a simple resignation. In my years of working with them, I'd never made a decision without thinking through every angle, every consequence. They trusted my judgment, even when they didn't understand it. "Oh," I paused at the glass doors, my hand on the polished steel handle. "Please tell your father-in-law that the 5 p.m. board meeting will be interesting." "What does that mean?" Carol demanded, her voice rising to that frequency that made dogs howl and caused migraine headaches. I didn't answer. I just walked out. I didn't storm. I didn't slam the door. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who knows exactly what time the bomb is set to go off and knows he has exactly enough time to get to a safe distance and pour a beer. As I stepped into the elevator, I checked my watch. 9:15 a.m. The Atlas protocol, my life's work, my digital fortress, had a heartbeat, and I had just stopped the pacemaker. Now we just had to wait for the patient to realize they were dead. There's a specific kind of silence that exists in the suburbs of North Austin at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. It's the silence of leaf blowers paused for lunch and Amazon delivery trucks idling at stop signs. It's the sound of middle America getting on with its business, blissfully unaware that 20 miles away in the tech corridor, a corporate empire was about to collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. I drove home in my F-150, windows down, no radio. Just the hum of the engine and the settling of my nervous system. 25 years in tech had taught me to recognize the moments when everything changes. This was one of them. Behind me, the glass towers of the business district grew smaller in my rearview mirror, but I could picture the chaos I'd left behind with crystalline clarity. When I pulled into my driveway, I didn't go inside immediately. Instead, I stood by my tomato plants, better boys and early girls that I'd started from seed back in March. They were looking good this year, already heavy with fruit. Gardening was something I'd picked up after my divorce 3 years ago, when I'd suddenly found myself with an empty house and too much time to think. I grabbed the hose and misted the plants, watching the water bead on the leaves. There's something therapeutic about taking care of things that grow slowly, deliberately. It's the opposite of the tech world, where everything has to be done yesterday and scaled to infinity by next quarter. My tomatoes didn't care about quarterly earnings or digital transformation initiatives. They just needed sun, water, and patience. My phone, which I'd left on the passenger seat of my truck, was lighting up like a Christmas tree. I didn't need to look at it to know what was happening. I could see the sequence of events in my mind like compiled code, each function calling the next in perfect, inevitable order. First, the gossip mill would churn. The engineers, Dennis, Ellen, Francis, and the rest, would be in a panic huddle in the break room. They knew. They were the only ones who actually understood the architecture. They knew that the Atlas system wasn't just a pile of code sitting on a server somewhere. It was a living ecosystem, a digital organism that required a specific biometric key to authorize any major changes. My key. Dennis would be the first to realize what was coming. He'd worked with me long enough to know that I never made sudden moves. When I'd taken him under my wing 2 years ago, fresh out of college with a computer science degree and no real-world experience, I'd taught him that systems thinking meant understanding consequences 3 moves ahead. He'd be running worst-case scenarios in his head right about now. Ellen would be worried about her job. She had kids in middle school and a husband who'd been laid off from Dell 6 months ago. She couldn't afford to be unemployed. Francis would be calculating how long the company could survive without its core infrastructure. He'd run the numbers before. During one of our late-night debugging sessions, we'd talked about single points of failure and what would happen if key personnel disappeared. By 10:30 a.m., Jeffrey would have tried to log into the master admin console, probably to change the color scheme or add his name to the splash screen. Something cosmetic that would make Carol happy. He would have been met with a grayed-out screen and a polite message asking for architectural authorization. He wouldn't panic yet. He's young, still believes that every problem can be solved by Googling the error message or asking ChatGPT for help. By 11 a.m., Carol would be getting annoyed. She'd be pacing around her corner office, the one that used to belong to the previous CTO before he retired early last year, demanding to know why Jeffrey couldn't just make the demo pop. She'd probably tell him to call me, and that's when the first cold tendrils of fear would start to creep in. I walked into my kitchen and made myself a sandwich. Turkey, Swiss cheese, spicy brown mustard on sourdough bread I'd baked myself last weekend. Baking was another hobby I'd picked up recently. There's something satisfying about working with your hands, mixing ingredients that transform into something useful and nourishing. It reminded me why I'd gotten into programming in the first place, back when coding felt like alchemy. I sat at my granite counter, installed it myself 5 years ago, back when I still believed in investing in the house I'd someday retire in, and finally looked at my phone. 47 missed calls, 12 voicemails, a wall of text messages that looked like the digital equivalent of someone screaming into the void. From Dennis, my former lead engineer. Andrew, please pick up. Jeffrey is trying to chmod the root directory. I can't stop him. He has admin privileges but no architectural clearance. It's going to trigger the lockout protocol. Poor Dennis. He understood the implications better than anyone else in that building. He knew that what they were witnessing wasn't a technical glitch or a system malfunction. It was the digital equivalent of an immune system response. The Atlas protocol was doing exactly what I'd designed it to do, protecting itself from unauthorized access. From Carol, Andrew, this is unprofessional. Pick up your phone. Need the password for the demo environment now. From Carol again 10 minutes later. I'm writing you up for insubordination. I actually laughed out loud at that one. The sandwich tasted incredible, probably because it was seasoned with the sweet flavor of poetic justice. Writing up a non-employee for insubordination was exactly the kind of flawless logic I'd come to expect from Carol. It was like trying to arrest someone for trespassing in their own house after you'd locked them out. I opened my laptop. My personal MacBook, not the company-issued Dell brick I'd left behind on my desk like a discarded snakeskin. I logged into my private email server, the one I'd set up in my home office using equipment I'd bought and configured myself. Technology was my profession, but it was also my passion. I understood it at a level that people like Carol never would. I checked my sent folder. There it was, sitting at the top like a smoking gun. The resignation email I'd composed and scheduled at 6:59 a.m. this morning. But it wasn't sent to HR. It wasn't sent to Carol. It was sent to a secure encrypted escrow service that time-stamped it and forwarded it simultaneously to the board of directors, legal counsel, the external auditors, and George Whitfield's executive assistant. Timestamp 6:59 a.m., 2 hours before Carol's little coronation ceremony, 2 hours before she tried to demote me to janitor status. Why did this matter? Because in the state of Texas, and specifically within the ironclad clauses of the contract I'd written, yes, I wrote the technical scope of work, not the lawyers. The timing of departure determined the custody of intellectual property. If I had quit after she reassigned the project, it could be argued I was abandoning my post, leaving them in the lurch out of spite. But I had resigned before. I had resigned while I was still the sole authorized architect, with all my responsibilities intact. I'd learned this lesson the hard way during the dot-com crash. Watched brilliant engineers get screwed over by companies that used their expertise to build something valuable, then pushed them out and kept the rights to everything they'd created. I swore then that I'd never let it happen to me again. The phone rang. It was the main office line. I let it ring, then checked my voicemail. It was Howard, the CTO, trying to sound calm. Andrew, we have a minor technical issue. Could you give me a call when you get this? Nothing urgent, just need to discuss some system parameters. Minor technical issue. That was like calling the Titanic's encounter with an iceberg a minor navigation concern. By 2:30 p.m., the first cracks in the facade would be showing. The marketing team couldn't update the website. The sales team couldn't access the CRM. The internal chat servers were starting to lag. Atlas Protocol wasn't just the new project. It was the spine of their entire operation, and I had severed it cleanly at the base. I could picture Carol storming through the hallways, her designer heels clicking like an executioner's axe. "I'm calling my father-in-law," she'd be shrieking to anyone within earshot. "George will fix this. He'll sue him into bankruptcy." But George was currently at 30,000 feet, flying back from Scotland in the corporate jet. I knew because I'd helped set up the flight tracking system 6 months ago. When Carol reached him, the conversation would be brief and brutal. "George, Andrew has locked us out of the system. He's holding us hostage." And George, despite his nepotism, actually understood what kept the lights on. He'd ask the only question that mattered: "Did you fire him?" I repurposed his role to streamline operations. "Did you fire him?" He walked out. He quit. When? This morning, right before the investor meeting. The silence on that call would be deafening. George knew I didn't do drama. If I walked out, the building was already on fire. At 4 p.m., exactly 1 hour before the board meeting, the legal department would be in full panic mode. Ian, the head of legal, would be screaming at junior associates like a drill sergeant at boot camp. Find the breach of contract. He's an at-will employee. He has a fiduciary duty, but they'd be looking at the wrong documents. The employment contract was standard boilerplate. The real power was in the Project Atlas IP agreement. The one I'd written 2.5 years ago when they were desperate, bleeding money, and their previous system had crashed for 3 straight days. Back then, I wasn't an employee. I was a consultant with leverage. They needed me more than I needed them, so I wrote the terms. When they hired me full-time later, they were so relieved to have stable systems that they just attached my original consultancy agreement as an addendum to the employment contract. Nobody read the fine print. They just signed. Clause 11.7, subsection C, a trembling junior lawyer would read aloud. In the event of project reassignment, demotion, or termination of the primary architect without a 60-day transitional period and written architectural sign-off, all external synchronization systems will automatically execute a protective freeze protocol. "What does that mean?" Ian would demand. "It means he licensed the technology to us. He didn't sell it. And the license was conditional on his supervision." Meanwhile, at 5 p.m. sharp, the boardroom would be filled with investors who'd flown in from Silicon Valley to see the demo. Cameron, the lead investor, would be checking his watch, wondering why the screens were showing nothing but red error messages. Carol would be there, sweating through her makeup, trying to explain that they were experiencing minor technical difficulties. Jeffrey would be in the corner, probably Googling how to fix server crash on his iPhone. Then George would arrive, still in his golf clothes, and the truth would come out. The resignation letter, the timestamps, the IP licensing agreement that nobody had bothered to understand. "He didn't sabotage anything," Ian would finally admit, his voice hollow. "The system is doing exactly what he programmed it to do. It's protecting itself." By evening, my phone had one final voicemail. It was Carol, her voice slurred with whine and desperation. "Andrew, it's me. Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but you have to help me." George cut me off. "Barry is threatening divorce. They're making memes about me. Please, just give me the override code. I'll tell everyone I figured it out myself." I saved that message right next to the resignation email. Evidence, just in case. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office at Streamcore Solutions, watching the sunset through floor-to-ceiling windows. Diana, the CEO, had given me everything I'd asked for. Full architectural authority, a team that actually understood what they were doing, and a salary that reflected my actual value. TechFlow Dynamics had never recovered. They'd tried to rebuild from backups, but without the architectural keys, it was like trying to perform heart surgery with a butter knife. George had been forced out by the board. Carol was working at her father's car dealership in Houston. Jeffrey was back in college, probably majoring in something safer like business administration. As for me, I was exactly where I belonged. Building systems that would last, working with people who understood the difference between innovation and destruction, and sleeping well at night, knowing that sometimes experience really does triumph over entitlement. The architect always knows where the load-bearing walls are, and when you try to tear them down, well, that's when you learn about gravity.